old Alien Insurrection Act as a basis for
That's
deporting.
almost an archaic kind of
And we see that the DC Circuit actually agreed that the injunction should stay in place. The issue is, very often, notwithstanding the injunction, you are removed. So then what is the recourse thereafter? You don't have the legs to fight, the resources to fight, you're outside of the country, etc. So unless the courts are indeed vigilant about the restraining order and precluding unjust removal, you'll see that millions of people will be in trouble.
Like what happened in the recent case where those 100 or 200 persons were sent out to another country, El Salvador. And it does report that quite a number of them were just innocent people in one sort or the other. Now, if this is taking place and accelerated at a pace where the court system will not be able to catch up with it, then one could interpret it as a purge. But we don't know. I don't know if that's ever too much of a strong word to use within the context of this, but it would give you that impression. But is this a good justification for making America great again? I don't want to get into a political discussion here, but I don't know if on this road.
Go ahead, Jamal.
Go ahead, Jamal.
Well, what I can say is that here in the United States, you know, the founding fathers have established that every person, not just a U.S. citizen, but every person has the right to due process. And what that essentially means is they have the right to be informed of any type of proceedings that are put against them, and they have the right to defend themselves in those proceedings. So something like expedited order of removal, in which essentially what that is doing is foreclosing an individual's right to seek any redress or to seek the, I would say, the decision of a judge, you know, having a judge step in and make a determination whether they should be removed or not. Something like expedited, you know, an order of removal now eliminates that person's right to due process. And that is something that, you know, as you mentioned, you could consider it a purge because it goes against the fabric of this country and having the right to be afforded due process.
But with that kind of a contradiction, I don't know, Paul, is that something that Congress can step in to do something about? Or is it something that would have to be negotiated with the president's office?
So when it comes to separation of powers, I think there are two basic considerations. First of all, what does the U.S. Constitution say about the separation of powers? But the second question is, what are these different branches of government actually doing right now? And what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that both houses of legislature at the federal level are basically rolling over. They are not standing up to even the actions that they are supposed to be taking in terms of the basic checks and balances that this democracy is based on. And that is why I'm saying right now that you have a government where the same party, and not even the same party, but the same branch of the party is basically dictating everything in the executive side with zero legislative pushback. And therefore, the last recourse is really the courts right now. And it's unfortunately that way. And I think you're seeing a number of decisions being made going in both directions with the courts. I think many courts are stepping in to basically push back on the most egregious examples of what the current executive is doing. I think there are also pieces of the judicial system that basically where the party in power already has a majority, such as on the Supreme Court. But I think you see that even with some of the Supreme Court judges, including Chief Justice Roberts, recently did flex his muscles and send a signal to the executive that they are engaged in overreach right now. Because once we are in a situation where the executive is defying court orders or does not feel compelled to respect the court orders, we are in an entirely different realm in terms of the basic democratic system of the United States.
Paul, Jamar, what are
Yes.
some of the things you see coming back at you at your practice in terms of the insecurity, the fear and trembling of various nationals who will come to your practice and say, listen, this is what my position is, this is what my status is. I mean, how can you help me to fix this?
All right, I'll give you a real life example that I'm facing right now. I'm reading reports that there is a deal in the making in which the IRS is agreeing or forming some type of partnership with ICE. And there are a lot of individuals that when they come into my office, I say, you know what? You may not have any relief available to you now, but if you are placed in removal proceedings, there's a relief called cancellation of removal, in which if you don't have status here in the United States, but you've been here for a substantial period of time, at least 10 years, then you could appeal to the immigration judge and say, hey, I've been here for the last 10 years. I've been here and I've been a person of good moral character. And by the way, I have a qualifying relative who would suffer exceptional unusual hardship if I am not permitted to remain here in the United States. And one of the major things that I tell individuals is, hey, I know you've been here, I know you don't have status, but if you are working and you're receiving money, it's best for you to file your income tax return. Because in those proceedings, although you have worked without authorization, it bodes well for you to show to the immigration judge that at least while you were here in the United States, you were doing something, you were contributing in terms of filing taxes. Now, within the, with this proposed deal coming into place where IRS could potentially provide,
after you because you're paying taxes.
yeah, and provide information to ICE, giving individuals their addresses. Now, a person may be reluctant to even come to me or to take at least my advice to even file taxes. And this is something to help, the U.S. economy in terms of reporting and filing taxes. So that is something that, I'm seeing right now where, to be honest with you, I don't know how to advise my clients, because what if they come to me and say, well, I haven't been here for at least 10 years, so if I file my taxes now, is there a possibility that the IRS can provide this information to ICE and now ICE can come and pick me up? I don't know what to necessarily tell them, and how to guide them, in terms of, well, I think you should do it, but you now are at risk of having this. Now, once again, this is something that has been proposed. It hasn't been finalized, but this is something that I'm dealing with real time.
You have that kind of thing coming at you, Paul? Because you're in a community situation where you have quite a lot of persons you have to interface with.
We are in uncharted territory. We have never been in this situation before in terms of the level of fear and the level of, how are we supposed to responsibly guide our community members in terms of making sure that they enjoy as much protection as possible, given these terrible assaults on due process. And Attorney Hinkson mentioned some of the issues about the IRS and the ICE basically information sharing. I think that we are also seeing a lot of information sharing between law enforcement, local law enforcement, and
ICE?
ICE, absolutely, with the 287G agreements. This is, again, a very, very, very slippery slope, because if you think about police officers, what are they supposed to do? They are supposed to provide public safety at the local level. That is the scope of their job, and the scope of their job is not to basically be deputized as an ICE agent. First of all,
but they're not going out and arresting people and taking them to ICE.
So
almost, is that what's happening?
What we're seeing is that the 287G agreements, particularly the task force piece of the 287G agreement, basically creates a situation where police officers, even in a local jurisdiction, a county jurisdiction, in some cases in a municipal jurisdiction, are given training, and then through the training that they will have specific police officers who will be potentially asking questions of immigration status when they pull someone over. And second of all, very importantly, the information sharing of databases, so that when the police officer pulls them over, something in the immigration database may appear, on basically the police officer's script, and then you have a situation where that gives the leverage or the leeway of the police officer to potentially go that route, if you will. And this is very dangerous. The most dangerous aspect of this is that you have a certain trust and a certain confidence between immigrant community members and their local law enforcement, which is crucial, for example, when local law enforcement is trying to solve a crime, and they have to rely on witnesses, they have to rely on what people saw. But if the first thing that's going through the mind of this
they're coming to arrest me.
Yeah, they're not going to stick their neck out. So this really is going to hit us in a number of ways.
How you respond to that?
In a couple ways. Firstly, you mentioned, is there a purge? The truth of the matter is that what you're seeing is consistent with the promises that the administration made to its base. Whether we wish to call it a purge or something else, it is not far removed from what the administration said it would do, okay? And the persons who would be targeted, okay? The persons who are being targeted are primarily not European persons, okay? We'll just put it that way. What I also want to add, however, is that there is a sharing of information between branches of law enforcement, and that impacts people significantly. But Paul, this has gone back to right after 9/11, that kind of sharing of information has increased and the partnerships have increased. And there's also the IHP agreement with ICE and local law enforcement. So if you are undocumented, if you have a problem with your status and you're pulled over for a traffic violation, that can result in immigration problems for you as well because of the shared information. Now, Jamal mentioned also trying to advise people, and one of my candid advice to people is to be sure that you understand your rights. And when I mean understand your rights, understand what you need to do when you're stopped, understand what you need to do if you are detained, understand what the consequences if you are at a border. They're not all identical, okay? And your rights are not identical. But understanding how important it is to speak with counsel. Remember that if you speak with counsel, ICE agents cannot listen to the telephone call when you're speaking with counsel. But also remember that unlike being arrested in a criminal case, ICE does not have to provide you with counsel. So these are things that you need to understand. You need to understand how a bond hearing works. And then we talked about due process. It is always important to try and get before a judge. That's what the Constitution requires for due process, and immigration judges have great discretion and latitude in making decisions. So Mr. Hinkson talked about cancellation of removal. And generally it's 10 years if you're undocumented and 7 years if you've had a green card, right? So you can ask the judge to say, take a look at all the evidence that I've provided to cancel removal. Now, there are other things that you need to know. Asylum. You can withdrawal of withholding of removal, right? So you can, for withholding of removal, explain to the judge, I don't want to return because, and there's the corollary to that, which is the Torture Act. But if you were to deport me, I would be exposed to harm because of the social class that I belong to, race, religion, political affiliation, etc. You can ask for an adjustment of status, right? You can ask the judge to adjust your status.
So you're talking about asylum now?
Asylum is one recourse. There's cancellation, there's withholding, there's adjustment of status. One thing that's interesting and came to my mind was because Paul just mentioned working with law enforcement. And I think another thing that people don't understand is a U visa.
U visa?
A U visa. By saying, hey, Your Honor, I was the victim of a serious crime. I have cooperated with law enforcement. I've assisted law enforcement in my community, etc. So understanding options at this particular time is critical for our community.
Jamal, he speaks quite a number of things which you had alluded to. Now, for somebody listening, and if you're just joining us, we're having a discussion here about immigration. To my left is attorney Jamal Hinkson. To my right is Paul Nemfrey from the Community Action Network. And to my extreme right is, of course, Ken Lewis, a lecturer in law, an attorney at law, and, of course, a corporate accountant. Gentlemen, the 1, 2, 3 citizen, we have a citizen now. People are listening to this, but, you know, and they are confused. There's quite a lot of confusion, you know, bats in the dark going around right now. What is the 1, 2, 3 that people should pay attention to in this kind of a unsettling situation?
Well, the first thing you need to establish is what is your current immigration status? That's the first thing.
And before you go, speak to a non-immigrant, a person who has no green card, and a person who has no citizenship, and they're here and they've been here for the last 10 or 15 years working, paying taxes, but they don't have any kind of status. That one first person.
So that type of person, the first thing you want to establish is, okay, you don't have any status, you don't have a green card, you don't have citizenship. How did you last enter the country? Did you enter the country legally? Because that plays a role. Because if you have U.S. citizen family members, you may be eligible to apply for what Mr. Ken mentioned, adjustment of status, in which as long as you can show that you lawfully entered the country, even though you may have overstayed your authorized stay, you may still be permitted to receive your green card through adjustment of status. So, you know, the first thing is, if you're a non-citizen, let's determine how did you last enter the country? Was it lawfully or was it unlawfully? The second thing you would want to establish is, now you determine how you enter the country, what are your ties here to the United States? Do you have familiar ties to the United States? There are individuals, for example, that, let's say, as we mentioned earlier, that they came here illegally. However, they are eligible to receive protected status, which is TPS. What I would normally tell individuals is, okay, now we know how you came into the country. Do you belong to any countries in which you're given some type of protected status? You know, for example, Haiti, if you're, or from Nicaragua, are you eligible to receive any kind of status just based on you being a national of those countries? And the third thing is that, you know, it's really important to at least just start the dialogue in terms of, hey, is there any way that we can formulate a strategy or a pathway to you achieving status here in the United States? So a lot of people think, hey, the only way I can get status here is through my family. And that is not necessarily the case. Ken mentioned that there's a U visa. If you're a victim of criminal activity here in the United States, there's something called an S visa, in which if you cooperated and you were a witness with law enforcement. There's something called a T visa, if you were trafficked here in the United States. Now, a lot of people think trafficking, oh, that means that someone induced me or forced me to come into the United States. And that's not necessarily the case. That's not what they consider trafficking. Trafficking is a forced labor, you know, whether it's forced sex labor or forced work. So a lot of times there are people that come into the United States legally on a visitor's visa, and they get themselves into a situation where now they almost feel that they're forced to work here in the United States based on the relationship that they have an employer. Sometimes people are even eligible for a T visa based on the relationship that they have with their family. Their family members are the ones that are exploiting them, and now they're eligible for T visa. So, you know, it's important to start the dialogue to say, hey, How did you come into the country? What are your ties here to the country? And tell me your story. Because a lot of times, individuals, even listening to us right now, you're not going to remember everything that we say. But the most important thing is to get in front and to speak to an experienced individual, hopefully an immigration attorney, and tell your story. And it is our job to, extract from what the individual is saying to see, hey, wait a minute, you said something here. I think we may have a pathway towards you obtaining your status.
But under this present dispensation, how possible is that for an individual to be able to do that now?
Well, the law is still the law. So, a lot of people think, well, because this administration is come into power, that now we must leave. In fact, I had an individual that applied for adjustment of status and was denied. And normally when you get a denial letter, it says you have been denied and you must depart the United States within 33 days of this, or unless you're going to appeal the decision. And that individual took those words literally.
And start packing up, getting ready to
not
go.
start packing up, left. Didn't pack, left. And what happened, and what is unfortunate with this individual, is that there is a law that says if you have been in the United States for a year or more, whether it was illegally or you spent a year or more past your authorized stay, and you depart the United States, even if you have a family member that is willing to file for you right now, and you actually go to your immigrant visa interview at the consulate in your country, you are actually barred from re-entering for the next 10 years, just based on your departure, whether it's forced departure, where you're being deported, or it's your voluntary departure, as this gentleman just did. So he was caught up in the hysteria of, I just got this denial decision, it's telling me to leave, I know what's going on in this administration, I'm leaving. And now, hindsight is always 20/20. He could have, if he was placed in removal proceedings, we could have reviewed the denial decision, but now he's sort of limited his form of relief.
So he's likely not to be able to come back within the next 10 years?
Now there are grounds in which you can ask for those 10 years to be waived, but it's almost like you have to jump through more hoops. And, he did that because he was not well informed and he was caught up in the hysteria of what's going on. So, before individuals make that leap, I would definitely recommend that, you still seek the advice of a trained, professional, so that you know where you stand, because you may read something and it may seem, I have no shot whatsoever, but,
But the burden of proof, therefore, will be on you to be able to...
Absolutely. I mean, when you're placed in removal proceedings, first, the burden rests on the government to show that you are removable. So that's the first thing. But after that burden has been established, then the burden then shifts
From the government to
from the
yourself.
government to say that I am eligible for relief and I should be granted relief.
So therefore, you need the advice and service of a professional like yourself.
And representation, too,
And
as well.
representation.
Absolutely.
How many of such cases do you have in your community, Paul? Do you have a lot of such cases at this time or have been having?
So we are hearing stories about people who have made that decision, but I've been in many panels with legal scholars, and they're saying exactly the same thing that Attorney Hinkson was saying. Not only about how people enter the country, do they enter the country with or without inspection, and how that leads to differences in terms of the way that they're treated, but also the risks of so-called self-deporting without informing the authorities that this is what you're doing. That it's a strike against you. But we have heard of very, very few cases where this is actually happening, despite the fact that we are being bombarded on the radio waves, we're being bombarded on TV with these commercials from DHS, basically, weaponizing really the threats of, well, if you don't self-deport, this and this and this is going to happen. Whereas, in fact, as was just mentioned, so-called self-deportation does carry very, very heavy risks.
Well, what kind of a multiplier effect do you, Ken, will that have on your family? You're going to be deported, but you have a wife or a girlfriend or baby mother, and your son or your daughter in school or in college.
It's very difficult because, as I mentioned, we forget that there's the economic and there's the psychosocial effect of these cases. And I'll speak to two recent cases that I have. Somebody brought two matters to me that I chose to take these matters because I considered how important they were to the particular families and the community. The first one is of a Jamaican gentleman who had applied to be naturalized, received a letter about things that were in his past. And this is why I tell people that it's important to speak to counsel. What I did was to take the novel approach of, oh, and I must also tell you that they were and still are inviting people to come and be sworn in or get your green card, but you may not necessarily leave. I'll just tell people that too, because that is also happening. But what I did was to take the novel approach of filing a motion before explaining his background and explaining why I thought he fell within the era for exceptions. And the representatives, including the attorneys for the US government, agreed. And so he was able to be naturalized. The other case I'll tell you about is a very novel one because it's a citizen, and she's Haitian. And at the time that she was brought to me, her son was 23, born here. Her daughter was 25, brought here. Now here's something I want to point out about how interesting this case is. Before she met with me, she had met with representatives of ICE and the government. She was even invited to meet one of the officers at the courthouse downtown, and she went and met with them, and they released her. And what's interesting is that when I called the officer, and I said to the officer, well, she's just retained counsel. I think this is a case I might want to take pro bono to help this family. Let me just tell you a little bit about this family so that you and I can work together. And he stopped me. And I'll tell you what he said. He said, Mr. Lewis, I'm willing to work with you, 100%. And if I had intended for her to be removed, she'd have been removed already. So I'm going to give you the opportunity to represent this person. And the reason I'm going to give you the opportunity to represent this person is because you're right. Everything you've said about her as a hardworking person with 2 American children is correct. She goes to work, she returns at 7:30. She goes to church, and when she leaves church, she goes to Denny's with her family. When she leaves her family, she goes home. What he was telling me is...
that she has been monitored.
Indeed.
Wow.
So what he was telling me is, I know everything about her. There's nothing you can tell us that we don't know because she's already been monitored. One of the interesting things with this case that I was able to successfully explain to a judge is some of the records in Haiti were destroyed, etc. And these are things that you might want to consider in terms of, is she actually withholding information and evidence, or is she not able to obtain and present the evidence, which is why it's always important, as I said before, to try to get in front of a judge, but to understand your rights and know when to speak and when to remain silent. Particularly important.
But this is kind of a little bit difficult for quite a number of ordinary persons out there who would not have the understanding of these processes to be able to deal with and to deal with these challenges and how do they manage. So, but now people now have to do it. Find a lawyer, find their self-representation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, I hate to say it, but you know, a lot of the clients that I meet with, they come to me deflected and dejected, and they tell me that, you know, their interaction with the immigration officer when they were applying for benefits, let's say naturalization, was almost seen as like an adversarial type of encounter. And sometimes, I hate to say it, the officers, you know, take advantage of individuals that are not represented.
And their ignorance, of course.
And I'll give you an example. I represented a gentleman who was applying for citizenship. One of the requirements you have to show is that you're a person of good moral character. This individual had 10 children. And the reason why this is relevant is because when you say you have good moral character, one of the factors is showing that you have supported your dependents over the last 5 years. Okay. So he had 10 children. However, all of his children were adults. So what that essentially means is you have to show that you're a person of good moral character for the last 5 years preceding filing for citizenship. So in his case, his adult children, he wouldn't need to show that he supports his adult children or he supported his children in the past because the statutory period to show that has passed.
Okay.
So we went to the interview and the officer saw, the list of all his children. And the officer said, okay, I see here you have 10 children, all right? What are the ages? He provided the ages of all his children. I'm there in the interview. I'm sitting next to him. And then the officer said, well, are all these children you have the same mother, all right? So that was a flag right there. And he said no. And then the officer said, well, how many different mothers do you have? And I said, you know what, officer? I'm going to interject here right now because this is not relevant to the examination for you to determine if he's a person of good moral character. And me and the officer then proceeded to have an exchange. And I said, if we need to, we can call the supervisor because my client has expressed that he has supported all his dependents. There's no evidence in his record showing that he has not or has failed to do so. So asking how many different children he has with different women is not relevant. The officer said, let me step out. The officer stepped back in and proceeded with the examination. I can only imagine if I was not there at that interview, what kind of questioning would continue and what he would actually be answering to, and then the documentation that he would have to provide that he could never find, and he wouldn't become a citizen. So that's why, it seems like, man, do I have to pay someone to represent me even at the last stage? Yes, I especially if you have areas that are complex, and even if you don't think areas are complex, it's the funny thing, Mr. Miller. I would say that there are people that come to me, and when I look at their case, I even might say, wow, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You have a good case. I don't think there's any reason for you to be denied. And then there are people that come to my office that say, I'm going to do it myself. And I'm saying, it's the exact opposite. You need an attorney right now. So it's the mindset too as well. But at the end of the day, I always tell people, even if you're not going to use an immigration attorney, at least seek consultation, advice before you file for any type of relief. So at least you know where you stand, you know where all the mines in the battlefield may be, so that you know how to prepare yourself and hopefully prepare yourself and arm yourself with representation.
Well, the situation is so complicated and variable that one now in this kind of environment that we're now in, you have to make sure that you get legal representation.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'll tell you this. You do not need, and it's not required to have an immigration attorney. There are certain areas of law where an attorney is necessary. Let's say, for example, if you're going through probate, the administration of a person's estate, an attorney is necessary. However, in light of what's going on in this climate, I would say in every aspect of your immigration journey, if you're seeking some type of relief or you're seeking, a benefit, it's definitely, highly recommended that you have an immigration attorney at least consult with you and hopefully represent you in those proceedings.
But Ken, green card holders, one would have thought that a green card holder would have been, exempted from a situation like this.
Can't be, because obviously you're not a naturalized citizen, and depending on the reasons, you can be removed nonetheless, right?
A permanent green card holder?
Yeah, sure, violent crimes, and trafficking in drugs. And then it's interesting how the Immigration Act defines aggravated felonies, right? So a person may think to himself, well, this is not an aggravated felony, but for purposes of the Immigration Act, it may be an aggravated felony and may be a reason for you to be removed, even though you're a green card holder. Remember, a green card holder just simply means lawful permanent resident. It does not mean United States citizen. Two different things, right? So where you share some of the same rights, you're also treated differently, okay? So that's important.
Because you're not a citizen.
Because you're not a citizen. When you're talking about this climate, there are a couple things that I want people to understand. One, understand your status, as Jamal said, but be mindful of the things that you are doing and where you operate and navigate. There is no need, if you don't have a valid driver's license and you're not documented, to drive a motor car. Because now you're willfully exposing yourself to the repercussions of being stopped by a law enforcement officer who is sharing information with ICE. Okay? You also have to be smart, prudent, and cognizant of what you're doing. Okay? Your work situation. What have you disclosed to your employer? What kind of employment do you have? Is it something that is going to subject you to exposure if you're undocumented? Again, be prudent and be wise so that you can speak with counsel and determine what are the options, if any, to change my status before I'm affected by any kind of removal process. It's so important. Now, this is not a knock on small businesses. I know there are a lot of offices out there that do process immigration paperwork or divorce paperwork for people, and they're not lawyers. I'm suggesting, however, that you understand in this climate the difference between a person who processes and an attorney. The person who processes, for example, cannot speak before a judge in immigration court. The person who merely processes cannot do an appeal for you because he's not a member of the bar. Okay? So you need to understand those kinds of things as well. I know, don't be penny wise and pound foolish. Don't spend, I need to spend $1,000 because this person said they'd only charge me $1,000. I don't want to spend $1,500 with a lawyer, but nonetheless, this person can't represent you in subsequent proceedings. Doesn't make sense. And as Jamal said, this is not necessarily the time in which you want to demonstrate that you can handle these matters pro se. It's not the period of time. This is the time which you want to confer with counsel and use the services of counsel who is intimately familiar with the law and the options that you have. Because if not, the consequences can be severe and permanent.
But Paul, so therefore the Action Network which you represent, you know carries the burden of having to provide representation for a number of persons, because how many persons are able to afford the kind of representation that is, the quality representation that is needed now to be able to arbitrate and to discuss and to defend people who are challenged in these circumstances?
So right now, under the current set of circumstances, and just to mention that the Family Action Network movement provides wraparound services to, primarily to low and medium income families, both with providing with wraparound services as well as granting them the tools for their own transformation and empowerment at a socioeconomic, financial, and political level. What I would say is that the first piece of advice, and this echoes some of the things that Attorney Hinson and Attorney Lewis have been saying today, do not engage in illegal acts. Do not veer from the truth in your statements. Much of what we are seeing in terms of the risks can be diminished by following those two basic principles. And the third one, and I will echo what's been said here, people need to be seeking advice from attorneys who are expert in immigration law. Because if you don't do that, there are two huge pitfalls and risks. The first risk is that you are spending large amounts of money and basically getting gouged for money that you don't have in many cases. And we've seen this in our communities. And much of our language, much of our messaging, including our Creole language radio, Wafam, which we do on 1320 every Sunday at 11, is to tell people to seek out expert opinion, both to avoid getting scammed, but also getting wrong information. You will base a series of decisions that you make based on what somebody's telling you who doesn't understand how the law works, and this is particularly true on asylum cases. And that's why, you know, any work that we are doing is generally done in coordination with immigration law experts, because you cannot afford to make these mistakes and lose your money over it, and maybe your immigration status
Absolutely.
because you've proceeded in the wrong direction.
But with that, Jamal,
Yes.
people with like yourself and Ken in the legal profession, are you a target?
Well,
You know,
Because you have to be defending me, them, all the persons who are so physically and otherwise challenged.
Well-
and you're not going to be necessarily seen in a favorable light, I would imagine.
there was a memo that was released
Yes.
that, you know, the White House essentially said that a lot of immigration attorneys are assisting individuals in perpetrating a fraud in terms of filing asylum. So, you know, it's, when you say, are we a target, I believe there's a stigma that is attached to immigration attorneys. And in fact, I'll tell you this, it's not all, you know, in terms of from the administration side too as well. There are some clients that you know, meet with me that I'm not their first immigration attorney that they've come to. They tell me, I had this immigration attorney or so-called immigration attorney that, you know, I thought that he or she knew what they were doing, and when I went to the interview, they just sat down and did nothing, and I felt that I was left to defend myself. So now when they come and see me, there's sort of a hesitancy and a reluctancy to, you know, I would say divulge information, as well as to trust what I'm advising them to do because of their previous experiences, and that's unfortunate. So in terms of being a target, I've actually, you know, a part in which I've seen where ICE has gone to immigration attorneys' offices looking for individuals. And so...
But is that legal?
No. You know, a lot of things that ICE is able to do, unfortunately, is from people being misinformed, because the go-around is that the person consented. They opened the door. They allowed us to come in. You know, ICE, most of the time, if they have a warrant to arrest some person, it's a search warrant, or I'm sorry, an arrest warrant. That gives them the right to arrest an individual who they suspect is in violation of some type of immigration law, and they are supposed to be detained. However, that arrest warrant is not a search warrant. An arrest warrant, normally what ICE officers have, is mainly an administrative document. It's not signed by a judge, a federal judge. So a lot of times, you know, you'll hear stories where ICE is knocking on the door and say, hello, this is ICE. We're looking for someone. Can you please open the door? And your natural, that's your natural tendency. I mean, anyone's natural tendency is there's some type of law enforcement at the door and they're commanding me to do something, so I'm going to comply with their command. And in fact, by complying with their command, you're now opening
yourself
up to being or having someone in the household being subject to being, detained. And now they can say, well, we had an arrest warrant and the person opened the door, so they consented to us coming inside.
No, the situation is so complicated and very like a crossword puzzle. What are the advice that you would give to the various persons there? But Ken?
So at the outset of our conversation, I mentioned that how it is critical for people to understand what their rights are and where and when. And that's what Jamal just spoke to, all right? The difference between an arrest warrant and a search warrant. I said at the outset, you still have certain fundamental rights: the right to remain silent, the right to ask for counsel, not to consent to search. But what I'm trying to get people to understand is that there's a difference between what happens on a border, what happens in an airport while you're trying to be admitted into the country, while you're on the street being stopped, versus while you're being detained and taken to Chrome. 4 different situations that you can approach differently under the law. So understanding the rights and understanding the law is important. Jamal also mentioned, that persons have come to him and said, well, my counsel was ineffective. The truth of the matter is, some persons don't even know that after an order for removal, I think it's within 90 days, you can do a motion to reopen. And one of the issues that you can actually argue is ineffective assistance of counsel, that your counsel was actually indeed ineffective when you do the motion to reopen. Of course, you have to present new facts, right, for the judge to make a determination, but that's something that people ought to think about as well. And so having the education about the law and the rights, it's important. But it is not, and I'm just emphasizing again, it is not the climate for you to experiment. It's not the climate for you to expose yourself. It's not the climate for you to participate in things that you ought not to participate in. You should understand, for example, that if you are charged with a crime and you're undocumented, the consequences aren't just simply what happens criminally to me. Do I get charged? Do I have a trial? Do I get an adjudication withheld? You also have to remember that there are consequences for your status. So these rights that I'm explaining and the consequences that I'm explaining is so important for the community to understand.
So we would have to embark on a major education program at this time.
Sure.
Citizens generally, because there are quite a lot of ignorance out there as it relates to exactly what do I do.
And I would like to piggyback on that because it's not also informing the individuals who may be in criminal proceedings. Sometimes, I get individuals that, this is how I feel. I'm an expert, I'm an attorney. Some individuals feel that because you're an attorney, that you know and you practice all types of law.
Okay.
And that is not true. And so I would have individuals come to me and say that my criminal defense attorney told me that if I take this plea, that I will not face any trouble and I'll be released and I'll be able to go home. Not knowing that that criminal defense attorney maybe does not have, and I'm being very generous by saying maybe, does not have the background in immigration law to advise that non-citizen that, hey,
within the context of that,
if you plead to this is going to cause an issue with you in the immigration context. So that's why, for individuals that are not U.S. citizens, even if it's in a criminal case and you have a criminal defense attorney, an immigration attorney must be there in that kind of instance to work with the criminal defense attorney. Sometimes there are criminal defense attorneys that are immigration attorneys as well. But to have that sort of cohesion where you're merging your rights and having someone defend you in the criminal context as well as advising you on the implications under immigration law.
100% right.
What are the 4 or 5 not to do's?
The 4 or 5?
For the basic average man on the bus, on the Clapham bus, to know, to remember, to be reminded of.
Well, to start, I do not answer questions. I do not consent to searches. You know, am I free to go now? Can I speak to my lawyer? I mean, this is some of the vocabulary I think
Absolutely.
we've been talking about here.
But if you're taken to jail, you don't necessarily must get the opportunity to have a lawyer, because it's not that you have a criminal charge.
Well, I'll tell you this. In the criminal context, you are entitled to representation.
Right.
And once again, you know, if you have not retained a private attorney, most of the time you will be assigned a public defender. Now, bear in mind, most of the time these public defenders, and they do a very good job, but they are overloaded with thousands and thousands of cases. And then on top of that, their job is to represent an individual in the criminal context. So that is their main function, their main responsibility. You know, to entrust that individual to advise you on whether you may face immigration consequences based on decisions made in your criminal case, you know, I think that's being very loose with your immigration life. So, you know, what I advise individuals, and in the years I've practiced, I probably had only about 2 or 3 public defenders that actually contacted me and said, hey, I'm representing this client, and they advised me that they have an immigration issue, and the family contacted me and told me to get in contact with you. So, you know, I don't know if that's a telltale sign that, you know, public defenders don't reach out to immigration attorneys, but in my years of practice, I've only had 2 or 3 reach out to me, and that's scary because I know that most public defenders are not, you know, as versed in immigration law as immigration attorneys.
And as you say, they are so overburdened with the various cases that they have on their hands that they don't have enough time to be able to follow anything of this nature.
And assess and evaluate, you know, what is going to happen outside of the criminal, you know, realm.
But we have a situation now that there's somewhat of an urgency out there for persons to get advice and to get representation, and need to know and need to understand what are the 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9 things to do or not to do when confronted by ICE, either in the supermarket or, as Ken pointed out, if you're at the airport or where, you know.
So what I'm going to reiterate, Tenny, is
Yes.
knowing what your rights are, also knowing what your obligations are. So why I say also understanding what your obligations are. So for example, I said that you have the right to remain silent. That's true. You don't have to practice self-incrimination, right? You have the right to ask for counsel, etc. But depending on in which state you live, statutorily, you may have an obligation to present ID or give the officer your name. It's not true for every jurisdiction, right? So understanding your obligation is particularly important, because why compound an issue or create a crime where you don't need to create one? Okay? So knowing your rights, but understanding what your obligations are. Now, remember also, ICE has no obligation to provide you with counsel. You are not under the Gideon protections of the 6th Amendment. This is not a criminal case where you're being prosecuted by the state and they have to provide you with a public defender. That's not the case.
But
if you know this...
But before you go there, if you are a green card holder,
Yeah.
and you're not a criminal, you never had any criminal charges, but you're stopped, are you dealt with separately from the person who is a citizen or the person who is a person who is not a green card holder? And how would the 3 things be handled?
If you're a citizen, you're dealt with a particular way. If you're a green card holder, you should be dealt with a particular way. Why I say should be is, you have to remember that with this sharing of information, an officer may stop you and may have obtained information that you may be right or wrong, right? That ICE is going to act upon. Because in your profile, in your background, like the lady from Haiti that I mentioned, there is this particular information about you that you might not even recall or didn't even know, and they are going to act pursuant to the information that they have. So you may be arrested, you may be taken down to Chrome, not because the officers are doing anything wrong, but because of the information on the record or what they have. Also, let's just be honest about the following thing. No matter how subtly we want to put it or whatever euphemisms we want to use, in this climate, you have to understand that there are going to be checks into your background if you're a green card holder to determine is there any basis to subject you to removal.
Which comes to the point then.
Period and end.
I used to beat my wife, and then all of a sudden, she reported me, that we had a fight and I hit her and that sort of thing, and it was reported to the police, that kind of thing. Then she came back and she dropped the charges, but the police still have the report. And then something has happened again, and she reported to the police, but then she dropped the charges. Fine. I'm flying into Paraguay, and I came back and I'm coming through now, in this time now, and I'm stopped. Talk to me.
Weaponized.
Yeah, so Jamal and I were talking about the importance of criminal attorneys conferring with immigration attorneys. Look, if you have committed crimes of moral turpitude, including DV, of course your permanent status is at risk. It's
fertile ground for them to, when they stop you at the border, to say, give you a hard time.
Yeah, well, this morning, right, the lady that hit the news feeds, the lady from Guatemala, 25 years ago, her crime, right, which she thought was adequately resolved. The lady is an expert in her field, gainfully employed, but that didn't stop the process from working. So this is why, and I've tried to say this as subtly as I can, but I want to be as direct as I can. If you have issues with your status or you're uncertain about your status, you should not be exposing yourself to problems. Your only thought process right now should be, how do I ensure that I can lawfully remain within the United States, and to consult with an attorney and be candid, because there's attorney-client privilege, about everything in your background and about all of your circumstance, so that that person can examine under the law what are the options for you. Now is not the time to drive a car for which you don't have a valid driver's license. Now is not necessarily the time for you to go into certain restaurants and work under the table that you know are subject to raids. Now is not the time to do some of the other things that you used to do before. It is just a different climate. And when you asked about attorneys, there's a special relationship with attorneys and the law, right? We have attorney-client privilege. We're allowed to speak to our clients freely and unfettered about the instances that surround their matter. But please understand that this is the first time that we've seen acrimony between the executive branch and attorneys. You saw what happened with the Department of Justice and the attorneys recently, all right? So we are doing what we're required to do, and you're entitled to representation under the law. Your attorney can't be a target legally because he is doing what he, under the Constitution, is permitted to do. So you shouldn't feel any fear, any apprehension in making sure you're speaking to counsel. Now, hear me clearly. When you speak to counsel, share honestly and share everything. No attorney can assist you if you allow your counsel to be blindsided by things that you've hidden.
Fantastic. The discussion is very deep, very interesting, very informative. We're speaking with Attorney Hickson to my left, Paul from the Family Action Network, one of the advocates in the Asian community, and Ken Lewis over there, attorney at law, lecturer, and corporate accountant. We have not even explored what this means in terms of, because there was an argument, gentlemen, and I just throw this open, that this will affect remittances going into the Caribbean, because there are quite a number of Caribbean nationals who will not be able to still continue to work under the table, will not be able to get any kind of employment whatsoever. And these are revenue people, these are people who generate revenue for the Caribbean nationals. You know, how do we see that play?
Well, you know, sometimes we take the approach and we look at, well, how is this going to directly affect me? But as you mentioned, let's take sort of a wider kind of view. And I'll give you an example, right? There's a draft of proposed countries in which when President Trump was joining his first term, he put sort of a country ban list. Individuals coming from certain countries are either completely banned or they have to subject themselves to extreme vetting, all right? So let me just throw this out here as a hypothetical, right? We're not too far from the, I believe it's the Central Broward Stadium. My father and I used to watch cricket, and sometimes they would have cricket tournaments here at the stadium, in which they would bring in teams, most likely they bring in the West Indies, and they bring in, you know, some other international teams. Imagine this. Imagine that now there is a potential ban or a complete ban or a restricted ban on Pakistan.
All right.
So it is not part of the Caribbean. It's, you know, it's out there. It has nothing to do with us.
But it's cricket and Pakistan.
But it is cricket. And now what is going to happen is that now the players from Pakistan are not going to be able, or maybe vetted to a point where it makes it very hard for them to come in to participate in a match here, which would generate income and stimulate the economy here in Florida. So when we look at in terms of, you know, the ripple effects, it is not just, you know, and I know we like to, you know, talk about the Caribbean, but it has an effect. Even if we're talking about the Caribbean, it affects, there's other parts of the world that this is going to have effect on, because we're all neighbors. We work as partners. That's what we're taught as little, you know, kids, that you work with this person, it's teamwork. So this is something where I feel that, you know, that could have such an effect in terms of, you know, economic effect. You know, I'm not an economist, but I know that if you know, if you had something slated to bring in a tournament here, and it's going to generate viewership, generate ticket sales, and now you're unable, based on a fear that, you know, people from a particular country cannot even participate or will have a tough time coming here, and now you have to think of alternative venues, that has a major effect here.
So Ken, you're talking about it's a two-edged sword.
So with remittances, the economists are uncertain about what will happen. So what Jamal said is right. Remittances affect the entire world. The biggest source of, in fact, people think it's the Caribbean, but India is the largest recipient of remittances from the United States. Last year it was 83 billion from the US to India, okay? Jamaica had a decline last year, and our remittances had dropped down to 3.5 billion US. What people are uncertain of is this: in the present immigration climate, will those persons who are undocumented, out of fear, stop sending remittances because they don't want to expose themselves? Or will they use relatives who are lawfully here as conduits to make the remittances? Or will it force the persons who are lawfully here to give more back than they typically would, because other relatives cannot contribute? So uncertain as to what direction it will be. What is interesting is that Florida and other states, however, are toying with laws that would preclude undocumented persons from sending remittances, right? We saw that Governor DeSantis has a proposal, for example, that you have to identify your immigration status before you can do
You can send
electronic remittances.
So the offices are either going to be closed or they're going to have a serious problem.
So can you imagine going to MoneyGram or to Western Union? And we should have anticipated the changes, right? Because we see how the questions have morphed to who is the person you're sending it to? Is this a relative? To now they're going to ask, are you a green card holder or a citizen before you actually send via Western Union?
And not only that, exactly, what's your status? What's your employment? What's your salary? Because if you are for 3 times in a month sending $2,000 or $3,000 down to, somewhere in the Caribbean, where do you get this money? Why are you able to send? So you find that something else starts happening after that.
And that already had begun to happen, but clearly we're seeing an entirely different type of questions, and we believe that this will have, an impact, because every time you introduce a barrier, you're just making it more difficult, and there's going to be a certain inelasticity where they're no longer going to continue in the pattern because it's just becoming too inconvenient.
Judge Ben, I really am intrigued by this discussion. We're almost running out of time. I'm just going to ask each of you just to, give us a basic summary, speak to some of what you have already spoken about, and give us the 1, 2, 3 or imperatives that you would love as a takeaway from this discussion, so that our listeners out there can understand this and we'll be able to take this away. At least this is part 1 of maybe a 3-part series of discussion, looking at this wider question of the immigration, the impact of this new policy by the administration on the wider community, and how we're going to have to really unpack it and interpret and deal with it as we go along. Do you want to start us out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was a great discussion. I think that is the first part in terms of coming up with a solution, is to have more of these types of discussions where individuals can listen. Because, sometimes people feel that I don't want to say anything because I don't want to get embarrassed, I'm scared. And now when you hear people talking and now you're saying, but wait a minute, I'm going through that right now, or my family member's going through that now. It brings about a form of assurance that, hey, now I could probably seek the next level of advice and consultation. So my advice, for anyone here that is not a U.S. citizen, it's important to seek advice and consultation with an immigration attorney. And especially if you have any type of criminal past, even if you said this happened 20, 30, what I tell clients, immigration is going to go back as far as when Moses was wearing short pants. They do not care. They're going to go all the way back. So especially if you have a criminal past, it's important to seek the advice and consultation with an immigration attorney.
If it's just for the little smurf with the law, it doesn't matter.
Smurf, smidget, a little thing that happened where it was not a big deal, let the professionals determine whether it's a big deal or not.
Paul?
Just to go back very quickly to the do nots, because we didn't close that out. If ICE is knocking on your door, do not sign any documents that you don't understand. Do not provide any information about your background, place of birth, or when and how you came to the United States. Do not speak without your attorney. This is, basic common sense that you want to avoid self-incrimination. I think that we are in a very, very dark time for immigration lawyers. Unfortunately, if this administration is going after, Paul Weiss and Perkins Coie, I don't think that immigration lawyers who are representing black and brown people are at all protected from this. I think we do have to continue with the public narrative of the importance of immigrants, and particularly immigrant labor in our societies, how they're paying $2.3 billion annually in federal taxes just in the state of Florida. How 30% of HHA, and close to 40% actually of HHAs, close to 30% of doctors are of immigrant background. Roughly 1 in 5 people are in Florida were born outside the United States. Roughly 1 in 5 of the workforce are immigrants, and therefore we see that if indeed immigrants are not here, if they're not able to provide these essential services, such as agriculture, put food on people's table, such as construction, such as urgent care, I think this society is going to take a turn for the worse. And therefore, we need to continue in our messaging, reminding Americans of all shades, stripes, sorts of the importance of immigrants and how their life will no longer be the same if we do not have the presence and the labor of immigrant members of our community.
Okay.
Well, first of all, Tenny, thank you for having me, and I'm honored that you asked me to be here. And secondly, it's always a pleasure to respond to the Flexx family whenever they need me. So I appreciate the invitation. This is a very important time, and I talked about understanding your rights. But just remember also that your grandmother told you God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Okay?
Exactly.
So this may be the time in which you listen more than you speak when someone comes to your house or you are detained, right? If you're not yet ready to speak with an immigration attorney, and I encourage you to speak with an immigration attorney, reach out to some of the grassroots organizations and the not-for-profits who have relationships with immigration attorneys, who can provide education to you about your rights and your obligations, okay? Because it's so important that you understand that first and foremost. And then most importantly, try to use the constitutional and legal processes to petition for redress so that your representatives and your civic leaders understand how important this issue is and how this country is in fact a conglomerate of immigrants, and that's why we have a statue in New York that says, give us your tired, your weary, etc., because we were considered the home for immigrant people. So we've built as immigrants the greatest republic that has ever existed, and we want to be sure that we can continue to contribute to its growth and that our children can benefit from it. So understanding the legal processes and the political processes, particularly important, and do not unnecessarily expose yourself to anything that could be detrimental to your status.
My grandmother always said there's more to the matter than the pestle. there are so many things that are here and unanswered questions and issues that we have not yet touched and are explored. In phase 2, we want to really look a little bit closer to, a little bit more on the individuals and how the challenges exist, because there's a 407 form that those persons coming in from, is it 407? Coming in from outside of the United States, you make I-407.
Yeah, I-407.
Which you make sure that you don't sign it depending on your status, or don't sign at all. The most they can do is what? Keep your...
Yeah, place you in detention and you seek, relief or review by an immigration judge.
There you go. But phase 2, we're going to look something at that. And of course, the whole question of remittances, and we haven't looked at the whole question of tariff. But then that's another issue. We want to look at how it will affect us generally in terms of goods and services and so on. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I'm Jamal Hickson, attorney at law. You want to share your number with the wider public so that people can know where to find you?
Absolutely. I'm located in Plantation, Florida. However, as an immigration attorney, which is dealing with federal law, I have the authority to represent individuals across the entire United States. My phone number is 786-309-7038. Once again, it is 786-309-7038. What is so good about that number is that it's a WhatsApp-enabled number. So if you or a loved one is abroad and you're saying, sometimes, Mr. Miller, when a person wants to explain their situation, they have a relative here, but it's best to hear from them, and hear it from the horse's mouth about their situation so that we can properly advise them in terms of strategies of obtaining status. So that number is also a WhatsApp-enabled number. So I'm going to repeat it one more time, 786-309-7038. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. You want to think anything about the Social Family Action Network? People can reach you about any issue that they have?
Traditionally, we've been in Little Haiti. We have a current office just on the other side of the county line. We're in Miami Gardens. The phone number is 756-8050, and again, we provide wrap-around services.
And that's 305
756
756.
8050. Shayla and Mimos will be very happy to take your call. And wraparound services, whether it's economic services, whether it's immigration services, we are a provider, and we want to connect with the community.
Thank you so much. Ken?
Sure, so I'll give you two telephone numbers. The first is 954-262-6222. It's 954-262-6222. The second is 954-682-7530. And you should feel free to speak openly and candidly. Attorney-client privilege, I can't share anything that you've discussed, but if you speak candidly, I can assess your situation. And just remember, I can choose to represent you for free if I want to, if I think your case is novel and interesting enough, and I can choose to represent you at a discounted rate if I choose to, if I think your case is novel and interesting enough. So never be afraid to talk to an attorney, because we are always here to help you. And God bless.
So until I join you again for the second phase of this discussion and other things, because there are other issues that we want to explore. Marco Rubio was in the Caribbean. That would make itself for another discussion. Until I join you again, Roy Telemiller saying thank you for tuning in and for listening in. I hope we have had some answers to some of the questions that might have been going around in your head. Keep tuned to Flexx FM Radio, Flexx FM Television, www.flexxfm.online. I'm your host, Roy Tenny Miller, saying what a pleasure it is to be able to share with you on an afternoon like this. Until then, you walk good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello? Outside.